It's my great honor to introduce Patrick Collison. He's the co-founder and CEO of Stripe, the co-founder of the ARC Institute, and the founder of Stripe Press. I also learned backstage that he is not a fan of Virginia Woolf because her novels contain too much interiority. And writing novels with too much interiority is, as some of you know, my entire life's work. I still very, very, very much look forward to this conversation regardless. Patrick and Luke, let's give it up.
Patrick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I think it's apocryphal, but there is the line about Freud having said that the Irish are the only people impervious to psychoanalysis.
Good. So Freud is in Andreessen's camp with the interiority, it sounds like, yeah.
The original Maxer.
The original Maxer, yes. Well, thank you. So, I want you to explain in your own words. You're here because, full disclosure, I'm the recipient of a new aesthetics grant, and Patrick announced a new program with Tyler Cowen to give grants for sort of aesthetic experimentation late last year. And it doesn't seem like last year is the first time that you've ever thought about aesthetics. Patrick is the founder of Stripe Press. Very strange for a technology company to start a publishing company that makes, hands down, and I truly mean this, my publisher might not like this, but the most beautiful books as objects of any publisher in the world. So you've clearly been thinking about aesthetics for a very long time. Yeah. So where did you personally get interested in this topic, and what is the origin story of the new aesthetics grant process? Where did it come from?
Yeah, so context for all of this is, I guess as you mentioned, I started, Tyler Cowen and I started this together, and Tyler and I disagree on most matters aesthetic, so the whole thing is a bit of an improbable collaboration, but I'll give my perspective at least, and if Tyler was here virtually, he might dissent at some parts. So the first thing is, and I think Dana is here somewhere, but various people, including Dana, have commented on how so much of culture and how so much of aesthetics is stuck. It's not really changing very much. And so if you look at the Bauhaus-Dessau building, built in 1926, it's this sort of modernist glass, steel office building, or something that has the appearance of an office building. If you look at that photo and you didn't know it's from 1926, you might guess that it was built last year. This phenomenon in architecture has is also exhibited and recapitulated across many other visual domains. I mean, there's just some strange phenomenon where we appear to be stuck. And the thing Tyler and I agree on is this question of, well, what could come next? From my standpoint, there's a second thing, which is, what exactly modernism is obviously not rigidly defined, but there was, of course, a movement in the early 20th century with the explicit conscious goal of repudiating beauty and prettiness and harmony and truth and virtue and dignity, and I think that program, you got to hand it to them, was extraordinarily successful. They really did re-vector art as a whole, and now so much of and by the way, I don't say these, I don't offer these characterizations to impugn these people. I think the best way to prove this case as to the motives of these people is simply to just go read them in their own words, read their manifestos. They weren't hiding it. If you read what the creators of De Style or any of these movements or Neue Sachlichkeit, they say themselves, we want to tear down beauty. We disagree with harmony. So anyway, I think art has been. These people were extraordinarily successful, and aesthetics has largely continued in that lineage for the past century. And then the third thing with new aesthetics is just this question of, to what degree can you intervene at the last stage of the funnel, right? Because obviously aesthetics and art is a product of culture and of education and craft and technical skill and galleries and selection. There's many steps involved. And we were sort of curious, well, by intervening at the last step with these grants, to what degree could you repoint things? And I guess it's too soon to judge, but that's where it came from.
So you're using words like virtue and beauty. These are sort of very charged, almost religious sort of words. This conference is about life. Is there then some connection between aesthetics and ethics, or aesthetics and the good life, as Aristotle might put it? Do you believe that, or else why, or if not, why is aesthetics so important to you?
Well, I think it's complicated. Obviously, for most of Western history, we've thought there is some connection there, and the Greeks thought so, and Plato thought so, and Horace thought so. And actually, the best thing I've read this year is we're just talking about Nature of Gothic by John Ruskin, and Ruskin sure thought so. But again, it's as someone pointed out last night, actually, maybe 1930s Germany was one of the most aesthetically educated polities and cultures in history, and it didn't rescue them, it didn't save them. So it's whatever relationship that's there is nuanced. For me, I don't know. There's it's hard to distill it all, I guess. But I was very moved by the Solzhenitsyn line in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he talks about we've the ancient triad of beauty, goodness, and truth, and goodness and truth people can dissemble and they can obfuscate, and misapprehensions can develop and so forth. And he argues that beauty is special because it bears within it its own verification. You can't really fake beauty, like the heart knows. And that seems like something very precious and special to me, and especially in a time where, again, at least in my subjective view, the world does not suffer from a surfeit of beauty. It seems worth trying to fan the bellows.
Would you go so far as to say there's an objective dimension of beauty that we can deliberate about?
I think it's intersubjective, as in, I think, in surveys, people, there seems to be broad, there's a great book on this, actually, the title, Beauty, by, gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Hey, the name will come to me in a second. But he marshals a lot of evidence about Stefan Sagmeister. He marshals a lot of evidence about the degree of general assent and agreement as to what constitutes beauty. And he finds that most people do in fact agree on that which is beautiful. And you kind of know this intuitively, as in people tend to go to the same sorts of places on vacation, right? Like lots of people go to Toledo in Spain, and not that many people go to Toledo in Ohio. Sorry to anyone from Limerick, Ireland is not very beautiful either.
Have you been to Toledo, Ohio?
I've not. Maybe we should all be going to Toledo, Ohio. Maybe it's just a branding thing. But people in general, there seems to be a lot of convergence and a lot of agreement. You see this in the literary canon to some extent. Although he points out in this book that there is a wrinkle, which is experts tend to have somewhat divergent views, and so the masses like things that are harmonious and melodious and embody conventional conceptions of beauty, whereas if you're a real expert, especially today, you like disharmony and discordance and things that are more complicated and challenging. And I think part of what's happened in aesthetics over the last century is that this divergence has increased. There was more concordance between what cultural elites believed was beautiful and what the regular person did. And now I think we kind of have two camps. You bring a kid to the Modern Art Museum and they're pretty confused. But I think you bring a kid to the Louvre, they have a better sense for what's going on.
Well, I can affirm, so a little known fact about Clooney is that every single team member that we have is either a writer, an artist, or a poet. Every single one of us. And we diverge dramatically on sort of questions of aesthetics sometimes. So, sorry to put you on the spot, but speaking of the kind of question of beauty, and things that we can all agree on, I want to show you something by some of my favorite artists, Elm Green and Dragset. They're an artistic duo based in Berlin, and This is one of their art pieces. There's actually a street outside. That is a silicone woman who appears to be asleep at her desk. And
And we're going to do a caption contest.
Yeah, exactly. We should do that live. And appears to be asleep at her desk. She looks completely realistic, and they provoke reactions from people passing by in the street. And another famous piece of their artwork is this is in Marfa, Texas. They put a fake Prada shop in the middle of basically a deserted highway, okay? And it's meant to provoke discourse. So is there, I guess, a place? I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that the silicone exhausted worker asleep at her desk is a beautiful piece of art, aesthetically beautiful, but is there a place, I guess, for art that provokes or probes and gets people asking fundamental questions? It's a very modernist kind of thing, to sort of probe and to the sacrifice sometimes of beauty. Is there any place for that?
I used to argue a lot with the EAs about EA-ship and effective altruism, and I think one of the best arguments for EA is to simply ask the question, what fraction of all philanthropic dollars in the world today are given in accordance with EA principles? I mean, who knows exactly what that number is? Maybe it's higher now than it was 10 years ago, but let's just say arbitrarily it's 1%, right? And so the claim does not have to be that all efforts or all resources or the totality of society's altruistic endeavors ought to be pursued in accordance with EA principles. Maybe you can be an effective altruist in the sense that you think it's 1% and perhaps it should be 5%. And I sort of feel that way about provocative art. I mean, clearly there are many instances through artistic history where things that we now view as cherished and wonderful and straightforwardly beautiful were seen as outrageous and provocative at the time. Dylan going electric at the Albert Hall, and now it's nostalgic to listen to that, and many examples before that. But I feel like provocation occupies way too central a position from my standpoint in contemporary aesthetics, and I don't know what fraction of contemporary work aims to be provocative. It's impossible to objectively define, of course, but whatever the fraction is, I think perhaps it should be a fifth of that.
So since you mentioned EA, I want to ask you a question about sort of the patronage and funding and the allocation of capital to the arts. Okay, so the new aesthetics grants, correct me if I'm wrong, range from $10,000 to $250,000, and $250,000 is a lot of money to a lot of people, especially artists. However, it's not enough to build a new building or something like that, right? And you admitted you're sort of coming into the last stage here, right? So what are you thinking you can change at that stage with that amount of money? And also, is there some kind of corollary to EA that could be applied to the domain of aesthetics? Should more money be allocated towards beautiful things? And what would that even look like? It's very difficult from an EA perspective to evaluate that question.
Yeah. Well, first off, a disclaimer I meant to give up front is, I am a tech bro, sort of masquerading as, somebody who knows sort of tiny fragment about aesthetics, but under no delusions or illusions as to, the extent of my knowledge here. And so maybe rather than anything I say being of sort of meritorious substance, just maybe I'm just a metonym of the broader phenomenon of Silicon Valley starting to become somewhat more interested in aesthetics. And so perhaps to these patronage questions, that's somewhat hopeful. I wonder a lot about this, though, to your question. I was recently in Detroit. Has anyone been to the Detroit Institute of Arts?
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing museum, right? Detroit was only rich for a few decades. Again, it's hard to define, to demarcate definitively, but let's say Detroit was rich, because the Depression happened, and so you have from the invention of the automobile to the Depression, not very long. And so Detroit was rich for much less time than Silicon Valley has been, and yet you've Detroit, and by the way, not only the museums, but the architecture as well, right? We could do the Silicon Valley art tour in a coffee break. So there is something strange going on with the patronage. But then when I think about that, I mean, there's Burning Man, right? And that's it's not fine art, but clearly there's some latent demand to produce things of aesthetic wonder. And it's not, I mean, it maybe seems uncharitable and presumptuous and inappropriate for the demand side, for the patrons or the would-be funders or whatever, to kind of complain about the supply. But I do think there has to be something where, again, whether or not you view it as desirable, I think the production apparatus of art has descriptively changed enormously over the last 60, 70 years. We used to train people at much earlier ages. We used to train them much more in classical techniques. There was much more of a sense of continuity with the past, where you're sustaining a tradition rather than sort of iconoclastically trying to define your own little patch. I mean, something I think a lot about is kind of the idea of groups, right? In that, we speak about art in terms of all these movements, Art Deco, Art Nouveau, Viennese Succession, whatever, Futurism. And these people intentionally, consciously, willfully affiliated in these groups. Like, they published manifestos together in the newspaper. And now, to be associated with a group is kind of pejorative. Every artist is idiosyncratically doing their own thing with complete independence, but they'd be kind of offended if you told them that they're part of some larger group or movement. And so anyway, my point is just, I think the supply dynamics have really changed a lot. And yeah, for whatever reason, I mean, I think on the East Coast, people still are still really into that. But for whatever reason, either because we here are all Philistines, or because, well, something else, it doesn't, people seem to prefer the Burning Man stuff.
I don't know if you know that I'm from Michigan, and we've got some Michiganders in the house here. And we love Detroit. I'm a Detroit Lions fan.
I was there for the first time recently. I thought it was amazing.
It is. It's a great city. But have you been to West Michigan?
I went to North Michigan.
North Michigan, okay. Well, you got to come to West Michigan,
Okay.
Southwest Michigan. I will be your host and guide. But is there a question of, so Y Combinator, for instance, which you have been involved in, I know you're very familiar with. There seems to be a nice mix of identification with the group in a positive way,
Yeah.
combined with, it's my company, with
Yeah.
a healthy sense of individuality. So
Yeah.
it seems like there you have a both and. Do we need a Y Combinator or something for art and aesthetics? Is there a place, is there a market for that? Would that help?
Well, I don't know this for a fact, but I've always assumed that YC was based on art atelier and studios, right? Where, I mean, so Paul Graham, the YC founder, he studied painting in Florence, right? And so, Rodin's studio and the idea of this kind of intensified hothouse sort of environment where you're both trying to pass on a doctrine and set of practices and knowledge and so forth, but also foster the emergence of the individual's creativity and originality. I mean, again, Paul never told me this, but I've always assumed that he was in fact influenced by the art world. It seems that the atelier, the studio, the sort of master artists, that has receded somewhat as a phenomenon in the art world. I think it goes back to this broader point about just changes in training and the supply and the production apparatus more widely. So I guess my view is, it would seem exciting to me to return to that, to see what new forms could be. It probably requires new patronage networks. And by the way, you mentioned effective altruism here as an example, and I think it's an interesting one to think about in the sense that EA had, from an early stage, still has a whole ecosystem, right? It has websites, it has communities, it has events, it has funders, it has companies, it has projects. Like it truly is a tapestry. And my takeaway from New Aesthetics, again, it is just a small one-time, one-off grants program, is that to actually catalyze the emergence of things that are truly new, we probably need a more complete ecosystem approach. I think what Nicholas Boys Smith, does anyone know Nicholas Boys Smith or Create Streets in the UK? No, okay.
No.
Sorry? Okay, one person does. All right. So he was a former consultant. I think he worked at McKinsey. And like many people, he became puzzled as to why all the buildings are getting so ugly. Like he's walking to work and in London, and this fact literally towers over you, and it's sort of hard to ignore. And so he has, over the last decade or so, he's written extensively about this. He has led to the creation of artistic prizes. He's got involved in certain projects. He's brought certain funders into the ecosystem. He's now thinking about training and the next generation of architects and so forth. But he's really taking a holistic view of the whole thing. There's now a Nicholas Boys Smith cluster in London. And I suspect, true progress here is probably going to have that shape.
As you were describing the network, are you familiar? You know our friend Nadia, a friend of Clooney,
Yeah.
Idea Machines. Yeah, so that was very much part of the inspiration of what we're trying to build here. And it seems like Idea Machines. I think maybe that essay needs a better title because I think it applies to more than just ideas, but the way that ideas are incarnated. And I think it probably applies to art as well. But I think that was the first thing that I thought of as you were describing that.
Yeah, I think she really gets how these communities work, whether it's in open source or other domains.
So I've been fascinated by a book by Lewis Mumford called The Brown Decades about the time between 1860 and 1890. And he called them the Brown Decades because brown was the color that was most associated with them. The world sort of looked brown. It was after the Civil War, and he said this is like a drab period. It seemed like a low point in aesthetics in the United States, but he's just an excellent writer. It's a really good book, but he said there was a quiet renewal happening even in the Brown Decades. The Brooklyn Bridge was constructed and conceived, Central Park. He talks about sort of parks as changing the context of an entire city. So the whole point of the Brown Decades was that there was a quiet renewal going on. So my question would be, I don't know, does our time have a color, I guess? But the deeper question, the real question is, where do you think the quiet renewal may be happening right now, the sort of invisibly, the things that we don't see on Twitter, X?
I've always been puzzled about Mumford being so bleak about the Reconstruction period because I think, and look, maybe it's always hard to appreciate one's country, having or as much as somebody who arrives at it starry-eyed. But I think American architecture between 1870 and 1920 is basically unquestionably the best in the world. Other places built amazing things at other times, and there was other good stuff happening even in those years elsewhere. But if you go to any American town, most of whose stock was built in that period, you're basically guaranteed to find it to be beautiful. I think his pessimism is a bit overstated. In terms of renewal, I think Twitter has been. Social media has not been great for everything. It's hardly an unadorned good for society. But I think it's actually, back to the Solzhenitsyn point, I think it's been very good for aesthetics because beauty bears within it its own verification. And there are so many diptychs and side-by-sides floating around the ecosystem where you do have to wonder what's going on. And I think you're starting to see hopeful grassroots, in particular in architecture. There's we mentioned Boys Smith in London, but there's a similar movement in Scandinavia, the Scandi revival movement. where they've decided to. Some architects have decided to kind of put their foot down. And has anyone looked at recent work with Iranian brick architecture? Yeah, there's amazing. I would actually love somebody to write this article, explaining how this emerged and why. But there's some really cool stuff being built there. So I think social media has been good for architecture, and I think there's some signs of hope. And then this is just maybe my parochialism speaking, but there's definitely. To me, there's a palpable interest in Silicon Valley that wasn't there 10 years. I mean, Silicon Valley was always into design, but I don't feel like it was into the larger cultural project of aesthetics and how that is codependent upon with the culture writ large. Whereas, I mean, maybe it's the Stuart Brand thing, we are as gods, we might as well get good at it. I think that as tech becomes more powerful and influential in the world, I think at least some people are starting to feel this sense that, well, we have to figure out our larger place in the cultural universe.
And by the way, I noticed somebody carrying on the Hamilton Society protocols by pounding the table when they heard something that they like. So you can feel free to do that. You can hiss if I say something that you don't like, not something that Patrick says. So feel free to keep the spirit moving here as we continue. Okay.
And I saw the drinks outside, which I assumed serving alcoholic beverages was in honor of the Irishman speaking, but I understand it was actually for the debate.
It was a request for the debate itself. We should still have it in here. I don't know. Feel free to keep drinking. I want to move now into sort of aesthetics and the sacred. And the question is basically, what is the single highest leverage point for aesthetic renewal today? And I think that it used to be churches. It used to be if you were a patron or an artist and you wanted to do something that would really move the needle, you would get a commission to paint the ceiling of a chapel or a church or something like that. So that, in my view, was the single highest leverage point. It does not seem to be anymore. If somebody painted the walls of my parish in Washington, D.C., I don't think that's the highest leverage thing that artist could do to get recognized. They might, I hate to say it, they might be better off making art that they post on X or something like that. That sort of pains me a little bit, but maybe it's not a bad thing. So what is it? And is the sacred does seem to be important to aesthetics and to beauty. I think that it always will be. So has the sacred migrated somehow, has it migrated to Silicon Valley, or what is the single high leverage point? Because the new aesthetics grants were kind of agnostic on the question of where and how, and I know you got a wide variety of ideas.
Well, two thoughts. So first, I think the sacred is an endangered species right now. It's not had a good century. I rather than the owl of the sacred, I'm not sure what avian species the sacred is, but whatever, was there a suggestion? No, whatever it is, I'm not sure. I don't know that the right model is that it migrates. I think it can just be under threat. And there's this question of to what degree or how does life can shape and influence aesthetics in various ways, and has, and neoclassicism reemerged in part, or neoclassicism emerged in part because of the excavations of Herculaneum and Pompeii, and we were reminded of the wonders of the ancient world. So it's kind of obvious life influences art. There's obviously the question of how does aesthetics influence life? Does it influence life? And you never know definitively, but something that Ruxandra, who's here, and I have been talking a lot about and thinking about for the last couple of months is, there's of course the question that probably a lot of people here are preoccupied with about, WTF happened in 1971, and why is everything so sclerotic? Why is everything so slow? Why are undertakings in the physical world now so challenging? Peter Thiel, who I guess spoke at this event 2 years ago, is one of the people who really directed attention at this question, but now it's caught on more widely, and Ezra Klein, of course, wrote the book. And the usual explanation is something like, well, we were just doing so much stuff in the post-war period that eventually people got a kind of future shock and pulled the handbrake. But we were building roads and bridges and skyscrapers and the interstate highway system and the whole thing. And this is basically the explanations you get in Ezra's book and in most other accounts. I don't think it actually works as an explanation. I don't think it matches the evidence, because if you just look objectively at periods in history where, in a material sense, society changed the most, the post-war period, while a lot happened, was not actually an outlier. The US changed way more in the 19th century and specific year in the Reconstruction period, as we were just discussing. You can look cross-sectionally across different countries, and there does not appear to be any obvious correlation between the magnitude of the post-war change and the aggressiveness of the regulatory or the procedural response to everything that was happening. So it's really not clear that that explanation is satisfactory. I think there's another explanation, another possible explanation that hinges much more on the sacred. And that is that until, you can't pinpoint these things exactly, but until the early 20th century, people and elites, people in positions of decision-making power, were broadly motivated by, very imperfectly and so forth, were broadly motivated by a set of ideals and beliefs about what should exist and how things should be done that accorded with that of the populace writ large. There was a kind of legitimacy to their work. And when the medieval housing stock of London was torn down and replaced with Victorian buildings or Georgian buildings, people thought that that was at least not a grievous downgrade, right? And when ideology changed, because aesthetics is never just aesthetics, it's a broader worldview,
Yep.
I think that changed elite outlooks. And when you look at the specific objections to what was happening in the 50s and the 60s that led to the backlash, they're very commonly expressed in explicitly aesthetically oriented terms. And so I think there may be a way in which the loss of the sacred is why we can't have nice things anymore. And in particular, why progress in the world of atoms has slowed so much. So as to how we revive the sacred, I mean, that's a hard question. I mean, the only solace I take is, there are instances from the past. It has happened, like Petrarch in the 14th century was feeling pretty grim about Europe and the Dark Ages and the internecine conflicts and all the rest, and called for a revival in the culture, and he kind of got it. I mean, again, we don't know the causality, but the Renaissance, at least chronologically, followed. So I think one of the questions of our era is what exactly leads to that return of the sacred.
So I have to ask this question, given how you just framed that up. So the most momentous change in the 20th century related to the sacred and aesthetics, I want to situate you around 1965. Does that ring a bell?
Say more.
Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. Do you have any you can say no comment, but do you have any thoughts on the way that may have affected the sacred and aesthetics and the interplay between the two worldwide?
I think I can only comment on one domain for which I'm extravagantly unqualified, rather than also venturing into theology.
Okay. To be continued over drinks at dinner, for the many Catholics that are in the audience, I know. Okay, how about
What's
this?
your take?
This is,
I feel like you're asking that question with a thesis glimmering in your eye.
well, there's a book in there, yeah. There's a book in there, and I will not do it justice in the couple of minutes that we have here, but I certainly think that when Peter talks about technological stagnation in 1971, my mind always goes to 1965 and Vatican II, and I don't think it's unrelated to technological stagnation. And I am a Vatican II guy, and I don't want anybody to interpret that as I want to go back to pre-Vatican II, but we do not talk enough. Silicon Valley does not talk enough about how even that event within the church probably affected the way that we think about innovation. By the way, René Girard has an excellent essay called Repetition and Innovation that I recommend everybody read, and it's about the relationship between imitation and innovation. Because remember, innovation used to be associated with heresy, and then that was somehow reversed. So, to be continued. But let me ask you a question now that is very much in your domain. AI, artificial intelligence, and the way that it comes to bear on the question of aesthetics. We're all thinking and worried about AI slop. I saw Substack now has an AI detector built right into the platform. And then you said it in the New Aesthetics proposal, call for proposals, that you are agnostic on AI. There was a question in the proposal or the call that said, if jazz did not exist, could AI invent it? And I don't think you answered your question. I don't know, now that it's 7-8 months later, do you have an answer to that question, or how are you thinking about the role of AI?
A few thoughts. Okay, can anyone name a work of art made with AI? I heard one yes. I can't, and it is interesting that we'll have a little meetup afterwards to share our favorite AI art. It's probably the case that most art that has ever been produced, already has been created with AI, right? It's mathematically, I think that must be true. And yet, maybe at best, a handful of people can name one or two works. So it hasn't broken through in some sense. Now maybe it will. I'm not saying it won't, and potentially be wonderful if it did. And maybe when we do this event in another 10 years, there'll be a cacophony of voices yelling out their favorite AI artworks. So I think the difficulty with AI art ties to something I've been thinking about with math and science and physics. So obviously we're getting this Cambrian explosion of proofs of long-standing math theorems and conjectures and refutations and the whole thing. And it's wonderful, and we seem to be headed towards at least a kind of golden era in math and probably in other sciences. But there's sort of an interesting question for math because what is math? It's not really just a collection of lean proofs for different propositions. It's a mental scaffolding and set of abstractions and formalisms and ways of viewing things and thinking about things and things like the calculus or Riemannian geometry or whatever. These were conceptual breakthroughs and new kinds of tools that could be brought to bear. Algebraic geometry, whatever. And all of the AI proofs with the magisterial sophistication of these models are being constituted in terms of the abstractions and the formalisms and the toolkit that mathematics has already developed and that has reached a kind of community assent among the mathematicians. But there's sort of a question of, well, if mathematics was really going to advance with AI, what we actually need is for new abstractions to emerge. But there's sort of a question of just how would that work? Fine, let's just say the model comes up with it, but how does it get adopted by the community of other AI mathematics models? Like, how does that sociological process work? It's pretty useless if your model uses a whole set of formalisms that I've never seen before, right? And so anyway, that's kind of the math version, but I think there's a kind of homologous version in aesthetics of, well, it's not defined, it's a contextual phenomenon. It's embedded in the culture, and how, like, is it necessary that it'll have to be mediated through people for that process of convergence and agreement and adjudication to happen? I mean, I don't know. I assume so. And then the other question I think with AI is, the thing that AI art is it very much puts the emphasis on the supply side, on these models and how sophisticated what they produce is. But probably 19th century France is when we saw the greatest flourishing and efflorescence of new kinds of visual art. And part of what was characteristic and distinctive of 19th century France was how visually educated the elites were. And so it's sort of a question for us of how do we up-level ourselves to be worthy and capable of the new possibilities of all this new AI stuff. And I think a lot in this context about Germany, where Germany has been, in certain ways is, preeminent in so many aesthetic domains, right? Whether it's classical music or literature or philosophy or the list is long. But who's ever, of their own volition, gone to get food at a German restaurant? And it's sort of an interesting question, like, well, why is the food so bad, right? And it's surrounded by places with good food, like west, south, even these days north. Germany is kind of standout in its deficiency here, and maybe instinctively you tell a climatic story. They can't get the produce, but that doesn't actually work when you think about it. And then you're like, well, maybe they're just not rich enough. But no, that obviously doesn't work. I mean, Italy's much poorer. And so, what is the reason? As far as I can tell, the reason is it has to be a demand side one. They just don't want it enough. They're like in many domains, Germans have great taste, but in matters of food, go west, young man. So anyway, I think in all these AI art questions, there's the reciprocal question for us of how do we become worthy on the demand side?
Made me hungry. So I want to go back to science. So as the founder of the Arc Institute, you're obviously thinking deeply about science and also aesthetics. Is there a link between science and beauty? Which may be the deeper question there, maybe is there a link between beauty and truth? I mean, I've heard the story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but that in the discovery of the DNA molecule, they knew that they had it, they knew that it was true because of how beautiful it was. So have you thought about the link? I mean, we typically think of science as kind of divorced from questions of aesthetics and beauty, but do you believe that there's a connection?
I think in certain sciences, I think there's a connection in physics, where, and I don't know, you can come up with some explanation where, like, to be able to explain very complex phenomena with a fairly small number of free parameters or something, that's a kind of, like, it's very clever and surprising when so much so much emerges from general relativity, but you can write the equations of general relativity in just a couple of letters when you get the right formalisms. Like, that's beautiful, and the Ricci tensor is amazing. But now I spend most of my time in science thinking about biology, and biology's so ugly, man. Like, it's really, I love biology, but you cannot look at biology does not respect any abstraction boundaries or any. You can't model any part of DNA as only encoding the sort of narrow semantic information. You also have to think about its like conformal structure and how it can be methylated, and whether it's horrifically messy. You just look at look at the STING pathway and what interacts with it, how it interacts with it. It's biology is just is you can tell that it's this it's this compassion. I mean, look, such a large fraction of our DNA are these transposable elements, that are just useless payloads as far as we can tell. Although it seems like some of them might have now been repurposed for it's the more you look at biology, the more you're like, wow, this is such a tower of hacks. And maybe it's beautiful in like a toddler's painting. It is beautiful in the sense that somehow the ugliness produces such beauty, but it's a very different kind of beauty to physics beauty.
I wonder if we could transpose the question. I mean, biology may be ugly, but should hospitals be more beautiful, right?
Well, to be clear, I think the techniques you have to use in biology to deal with the complexity, I think those techniques are incredibly beautiful. And like when I first, won't bore everyone with the explanation, but like when I first understood the relatively recently invented technology of genetic screens, where you kind of test in parallel, or you make a bunch of changes in parallel across the genome, and then you sort of test the results. That's so clever, and it's so cool. And biology is, in this obstreperous way, making your life so hard, because it's so, like there's so much combinatoric complexity and so many interactions and so forth. And then you have this really elegant thing for bringing some order to bear on it. So yeah, maybe the answer is the beauty lies on the interrogation side rather than on the phenomenon side.
Yeah. They just turned the lights up. I don't know what kind of a signal that is here. But so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we have time for just a couple audience questions. So my last question, in the spirit of your project and what you're seeding here, and what might emerge from the new aesthetics grants. Try to finish this sentence, and you don't need to do it in one word. But new aesthetics will have succeeded when?
There are multiple independent groups pursuing higher ideals that are having noticeable impact on the culture.
Thank you. Sure. Good. There's nothing to add to that. So let's take a couple of questions from the audience, and I want to start with my colleague Brandon Vaidyanathan. If he's in the audience, if you could raise your hand, if somebody could get Brandon a mic, and then we'll take one or two more questions after Brandon. I don't.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Hello?
There we go.
Oh, this
Yep.
is working. Great.
Yep.
Patrick, wonderful talk. Really appreciated the dialogue. So my name is Brandon. I work with Luke at the Catholic University of America, where I have been studying beauty empirically as a sociologist for the past 10 years. I also run a platform called Beauty at Work. One of the things we're organizing this fall is actually a conference on beauty, space, and the sacred. Nicholas Boy Smith will be coming. We're celebrating Gaudi's 100th anniversary, so everyone please join us if you can. I want to share with you a couple of data points from my research, Patrick, and then ask you a sort of a piece of practical advice from them. So the first one is on this thing of beauty and science. We actually conducted the world's first ever international study of the role of beauty in science, surveyed thousands of physicists and biologists. We can tell you where biologists find beauty. There's a lot of it to be found. But one of the challenges that we found is so where scientists agree that they find beauty is in the beauty of understanding. So grasping the hidden order and inner logic of things, that's a key motivator, but they say that their institutions make it hostile for them to pursue that kind of beauty. So that the state of modern science, right? The second question also about work is this. So we also just finished a population survey of the US and the UK, 10,000 people, nationally representative. And we can tell you there's a lot of convergence, as you said, in where people find beauty. There's also convergence in where people don't find beauty. Ranking at the bottom are work and the digital world, right at the bottom. Where people find beauty in their work is in a number of places, but what really matters for their flourishing is finding beauty in accomplishment. So we have business leaders who come and talk to us and want to know what to do with our data. So if you have any advice for folks in either Silicon Valley or business leaders who want to bring this data to bear on their work, who want to bring beauty into their context where maybe people desire it, but they don't quite know how to instantiate it, what would be the first thing you would ask these leaders to change in their organizations?
On the scientist front, just kind of a side comment, but I think one of the great tragedies of modern science is the fraction of scientists who aren't doing what they want to be doing. And sort of to your point, I think scientists are like, being a scientist is such a hard career, right? In so many ways, the system makes things hard. Nature makes things hard, and is hiding all of its secrets from you. It's much worse paid than being in the private. Like it's a tough life, and the fact that we deprive scientists of the most beautiful gift that we could give them, which is the ability to pursue a research agenda of their own choice, I think is really a grievous mistake. We ran a survey a couple of years ago, and 78% of top biologists said that if they had not more money, but flexible money that they could direct however they so choose, 78% of them said they would change their research agenda a lot, which is a stat that I have to reflect on. The last part of your question about advice for leaders, I'm a newcomer to all this beauty stuff, so I don't presume to know yet. I've been very struck by we've really over the last 4 years or so at Stripe increased our emphasis on how much we want people to do beautiful things, and how our utility function is not just the standard ones that one might expect of a company, and that we want to be, and that we're excited to be surprised by the different ways in which people interpret that. And I now find myself regularly surprised. Just telling a friend recently, just this past week, somebody proposed for, we're issuing a new kind of card for one of our products, and this person proposed, without my suggestion, that we commission a bunch of artists with this sort of particularly cleverly thought through brief, and they've like a whole thing. But the point is, it was very much bottoms up, and now people in our workplace team are coming to us with ideas as to how they can do some kind of unusual things in the offices to, at least in their eyes, bring more beauty to. So I've just been. I think there's a real. Again, the most. I'm not a conspiratorial person by disposition, but sometimes late at night I feel that there's been an anti-beauty conspiracy in the culture going on again about a century, and I think the good news, if that's true, is there's so much latent demand that when you just sort of uncork it and give people permission, there's actually just a lot of enthusiasm there.
Time for just about 5 minutes. Time for a couple more.
Hello, I'm Lila. I'm a writer at The Atlantic. We've been circling this question of new aesthetics somewhat abstractly, and to make it more concrete, I want to ask, do you see specific new aesthetic clusters already emerging? And if that's too difficult a question, do you have intuitions as to what sort of shape these new aesthetic clusters may take? Or, to make it even easier, what do you personally find compelling in the projects that you are funding?
The most striking cluster was international architecture. It's definitely more creative outside the US than in the US. I don't totally know why. We mentioned the Iranian brick architecture, but it's definitely not only there. And to be clear, it's not just like, there's a bunch of Twitter accounts, promoting various versions of trad revival, and compared to much of what is built today, that might be better and preferable, but there's also a lot of very contemporary stuff happening in Latin America, happening in, actually Spain seems to be particularly propitious for some reason. So it's international architecture writ large, I'd say, it seems very promising. We funded Ali Han, an architect in Barcelona, for example, as one of the awardees. The thing that I really hope to see, and this was not like the point of the program or the project, but just kind of my hope is again, there's a lot of desire to return with a V to various forms of classicism, Neo-Grecan, whatever, and Art Deco. And I'm not opposed to that as such. Maybe some people can really make that work, but what I really hope for is a return to the prior lineage. Like, we had a great thing going, and the question I wonder about a lot is not how do we recapitulate Art Nouveau and Art Deco and various other contemporary, like Frank Lloyd Wright, but like, what would their successors have been? The international style came to the US around 1930 and just essentially won overnight, and kind of a lot of emergent American architectural styles never reached what I think their potential was, or never birthed their logical successors. So personally, I hope to see a return to that logical continuity.
One more question.
Yeah, we have one more question here, and it's from me. Patrick, to make the question even more concrete, would you react to a piece of artwork for us live right now? This is one of my recent favorites, behind you. Just a reaction. Or you can pass.
Well, I mean, I don't fashion myself an art critic, so I.
We just want to hear from you.
There's a lot that. It's definitely true that to appreciate many forms of art, it first requires some amount of education, and I don't understand enough of the cultural context of beeswax art.
Thank you.
I feel like that was a plant by my team, so that does not count. I'm going to get one more question somewhere. I don't know where the microphone is. Let's make it 2 minutes.
If it was submitted to New Aesthetics, it would not have received an award.
I don't know if somebody on my team wants to say a word about what I think that is. Okay, wait.
I don't want to hear Lincoln. Okay. Thank you for passing on beeswax art explanations. So Patrick, my question is getting back to AI art and sort of that conversation about jazz. I like to think about how exciting and aspirational the opportunity set is with AI accelerated research, AI accelerated coding, all these things, and just the leverage that's going to compound. And with art, I think the goals and the validation and the evals are maybe more unclear. And would it create jazz? But I think the question is, if you played jazz to somebody and jazz didn't exist, would they have liked it? It was a cultural there was a go-to-market for jazz, and it worked. And
But very controversial initially.
Right. Yeah, totally. There was a go-to-market for LGBTQ, and that was very controversial, and it ultimately worked in Obergefell. But anyway, to my question, sorry. In AI art, if we think about how simple a Julia set is, like the Mandelbrot set, and how complex the boundary can be, that I almost think of jazz as occupying, one of these beautiful colors on the exotic race to Z²+C. So in more complex, multidimensional, who knows what, that we discover with AI, maybe we can discover AI art, maybe it's beautiful, but how are we going to tell? What are the evals going to be, and how can we as humans evolve our verification set to understand beauty writ large?
I mean, I think that's not just one of the central questions for AI art. I think it's one of the central questions for AI, right? What do we do about the domains? in which hill climbing the evals is not going to be easy because, as you say, either the evals aren't there or the things we want to eval haven't been created yet or something. And so I think it's one of the big open questions in AI.
Thank you. Patrick, we know how busy you are. I've watched CNBC the last couple of weeks, so I really know how busy you are. So it means so much that you would take the time to be here.
This is a wonderful event. Thank you so
Thank you
much
so
for
much for being
putting
here,
it together.
Patrick.
And thank you to the whole team.